everybody. Thank you so much for being here. This is my free philosophy class called Crisis Meets Curiosity. And if you have any anything that you're having trouble, is everyone seeing it all right? Give me a nod. Yes, good. All right. So I want to introduce myself first. If you don't know me, my name is Danielle LaSusa. I am a practical philosopher. What does that mean? It means I have a PhD in philosophy, and I do these sorts of things. I'm a philosophical coach, which is a title that I just sort of made up, but I will tell you more about it in a minute. I'm also a writer and a speaker, and I have a podcast called Think Hard Podcast, which brings philosophical thinking to everyday issues. And so that's a little bit about my work. Now, philosophical coach, what is that? So I want to note that, philosophers have been around for a long time. And in fact, back in the day, philosophers were sort of the original counselors. They were the original therapists and coaches, life coaches. In ancient Greece, if you had a problem or an issue that you wanted help with, you either went and saw a priest or a philosopher, because therapists did not yet exist. Psychology actually as a discipline didn't exist until about the 19th century. So philosophers actually have been playing the role of counselor for a long time. And now there is a sort of resurgence in the philosophical tradition to do this sort of work. So I work with people one-on-one. I also teach workshops. And here's a little bit more about what I do. I use my PhD in philosophy to help people think clearly and choose wisely and live purposefully. I specialize in helping moms grapple with what it means to make a human person. I am a mother myself. I have a 4-year-old daughter and had a really difficult transition with that. And it really gave me the desire to help other women through that transition, because I think it can be really philosophically challenging. And then I also, I work one-on-one with clients as a philosophical coach. I teach workshops, and I teach a course called The Meaning of Motherhood. I have about 16 years of teaching experience. Most of that teaching experience is in academic environments. And then in the last few years, I've started this independent practice of bringing those skills and that teaching to the general public. That's a little bit about me and about my background. So today in this class, just a little summary of what we're going to cover. So we're going to talk about how to harness curiosity as a tool to turn this current crisis into a time of growth and healing. So we'll talk about why curiosity is the best antidote to suffering, or at least I think it's one of the best, if not the best. We'll talk about how curiosity can shift your attitude from resistance to acceptance. And we'll sort of look at 4 questions, I think really powerful questions that I believe can really change the way you respond to this and any crisis happening in your life. And then we'll talk about reasons that you might avoid being curious, or you may fail to be curious, and how to work with those. So I'll kind of go through some of my thoughts on all of that, and then I'm going to ask for a volunteer or two to receive sort of live on-the-spot coaching. And then we'll end with a Q&A. So I asked for a volunteer ahead of time. I did not get any. So perhaps after you see my presentation and know that it's, yeah, Jake, you're going to do it? All right. Anybody else want to put your hand up?
I'll do it.
Yeah? All right. Awesome. Okay. Well, hopefully we'll have time for both of you. We'll start with Jake. And if we have time, then unless you want to defer to Susan, Jake. Oh, who said that? Was it Susan or Allison? Oh, it was Allison. Allison said it. Okay, cool. Well, one or two of you will go. I'll maybe make you choose. Okay, so then we'll end with the Q&A. You can answer some questions or ask some questions about what we cover. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. So we're going to start with some etymology, which is the study of the origin and use of words. And I like starting with etymology because I'm kind of a word nerd, and also because philosophers tend to start conversations with definitions. We want to know what it is that we're talking about, and it's important for us to understand what we mean when we're kind of jumping into something. So I like to start there. So we've got two words that we're dealing with here, crisis and curiosity or curious. Okay, so I want to talk about what each of those mean. So the word crisis comes from the Greek, and it means a decisive or turning point. And I think interestingly, it means specifically having to do with an illness. It actually originated that it specifically had to do with an illness. A crisis, it's a decisive or turning point of like what to do about this moment in the illness. Seems apropos for our moment. And it comes from the root cri, which means to sieve or sift, which I think is really interesting, that the idea that we have this crisis and we have a decisive moment in which we have to kind of sift through what's important, what's valuable, what we need, what we want, where we're going, what to get rid of. Really is when you sift, you get rid of things, and whatever's left over is what you value. The other word, curious, comes from the Latin curiosus, which means careful, and from the root cura, which means care. And so in like the 13th century, for example, the word curiosity meant a careful or fastidious attention to detail and to subtlety in particular. And so it seems to me that that word care is important too, because we bring care to whatever it is we're looking at, and we look at the things that we care about. And so in both senses of the word, we bring, curiosity means bringing care. So if we put these things together, crisis and curiosity, to me, that means that, to me, crisis and curiosity means to bring careful attention to sifting through a decisive turning point. Right? And that's sort of what we're doing here. We're sifting through this decisive turning point. And I imagine that for many of you, COVID-19 has brought a decisive turning point to you, right? You have, perhaps you've lost your job. That is like a huge thing for people. We spend so much of our time, and we actually spend so much of our identity with our jobs, that once that's suddenly gone, it can be not only a crisis of career or job, but a crisis of identity, crisis of meaning and purpose, this feeling of being aimless and not knowing what to be doing with yourself. Maybe you didn't lose all your job altogether, but you have a business that is like failing, and you have to figure out like, okay, now what do I do? I've got to pivot to offer a different kind of service or a different kind of thing, and what do I do with that? So it's this kind of really big shift there. Relationships, I don't know about you, but people in my household those relationships have gotten a lot of attention these days, specifically my relationships with my husband and my 4-year-old, and some of them have reached moments of what feel like crisis. And there's also the relationships with people maybe that you don't live with, people who are far away. How do you see them, and how often, in what medium do you see them? How to manage who you see and levels of risk. All of these relationships have to be negotiated, and suddenly, like, which relationships are really valuable to me? Which ones can I kind of like put on the back burner? Who am I gonna risk my health and safety for? Certainly all of this can bring about a crisis of your inner life and your mental well-being. It all piles on. Anxiety is high, fear is high, a feeling of uncertainty is high, and all of that sort of can bring about depression, anxiety, this rootlessness. Another thing I think that I don't know if you are sensing, but I'm sensing this kind of crisis I mean, our natural environment was already in a kind of crisis, right? Climate change as a kind of crisis. But I think seeing the impact of our way of living, and suddenly when it stops, right? Like the channels in Venice are clear and you can see the Eiffel Tower from London now. Like suddenly it's like, oh, they weren't kidding about that. And suddenly the feeling of that natural environment crisis is much higher. And then politics. So I've talked to clients and to other participants who have said, you know, I feel like we're going into a civil war, right? That might be or I'm afraid of a civil war. Or I'm afraid of political leaders maybe taking on more power and control, or using this crisis as an opportunity to take more power and control. And, you know, it may be that you feel like our democracy is in a kind of crisis, or our global political climate is in a kind of crisis. So all of these things are reaching this fever pitch at the same time, and it's really hard, right? And it's really overwhelming. And of course, when we feel that, like all of those things at once, it's a lot of change, it comes with a lot of feelings, and we feel a lot of resistance to it all, right? Because we resist change, and we resist when things feel uncertain, right? And so what happens then is, you know, for many of us, we feel that crisis then state brings on this feeling of not knowing what to do next, and frankly, of a lot of suffering, right? And we feel suffering when we resist what is happening, right? Resistance to what is, to what's actually happening in the world leads to suffering. When we look around, we say, it shouldn't be this way. I don't like it this way. I don't want it to be this way. I want it to be the way it was before, right? All of that leads to a deep kind of suffering that we experience. Okay, so now what to do about this all? I want to tell you why I think curiosity is such a powerful tool in this approach to managing a crisis. And I'm going to do it by telling a little story about me. So I was at this was, 7 years ago. I was at a meditation retreat, right? A 10-day silent Vipassana meditation retreat, where at the beginning of the retreat, you were asked to hand over your cell phone, and you don't bring a notebook, you don't bring any reading materials, you don't bring anything to write with, you don't have any contact with the outside world, you just have your thoughts and a quiet room for 10 days. And so, you know, often that looks a little something like this that you see on the screen there, but of course, after like 6 or 7 days, it started to feel a bit like this, right? And I was definitely feeling that way. So this was actually my second retreat of this kind. I'm such a masochist that I had to go back after doing it once and do it again. And I remember it was, so our schedule was every day we would do 3 hour-long group meditations. So like, 8 in the morning, and then like 2:30, and then again I think it was 6 o'clock. We would go into the meditation hall and have to sit for an hour and meditate as a group. And there was about 150 of us. And it was day 7. And it was after lunch, and I was outside, and it was sunny outside. And I was just like, so done. I was like, my body was just quivering after sitting in quiet for 7 days. And I was just like feeling terrible. I just was like, I felt nauseous, my head hurt, everything felt terrible. I wanted to leave so badly. And I thought about like, how do I get home? Because I hadn't driven, I'd gotten a ride there. And I'm like, how do I get out of here? I'm in the woods in the middle of Massachusetts. Could I call a taxi? And then they're ringing the 2:30 gong. All right, time to come in for your meditation. And I was just like, oh my God, I can't do this. Get me out of here. I can't do this. I can't do this. I can't do this. And they're ringing the gong. And the thing is, if you don't show up for the group meditation, a volunteer who helps work the retreat will come looking for you. They'll come to your room, they'll wander around the grounds looking for you to get you to come. And so I was just like, and if you go in and then you leave, someone will follow you and like make sure that you're okay and then like gently bring you back. Because the whole point is like, you have to be here and face it. Deal with whatever's going on with you. Don't run away, sit down and look at it. And I really, really, really did not want to sit down and look at what was going on with me. But they're ringing the gong. So I'm just like, all right, crap. So I sit down in the hall, get on my cushion, and I'm just like, I don't want to be here. Please don't make me. I can't do it. And my knees are bouncing, and I'm like wiggling in my seat, and it's going to be an hour. And the other part of this is that during these 1 hour meditations, by this point at day 7, you were asked to make a strong determination during this hour for the entire hour not to move or change position, right? So you're supposed to sit quietly for an hour with your eyes closed without moving. And I'm in this state. And I was like, I'm never going to get through this. I'm never going to get through this if I keep resisting it like this. And so I did the only thing I could think to do, right? The lights are dim, they start playing the chanting, and like, now we're just like sitting quietly. And I was just like, okay, if you're gonna be here, Danielle, if you're gonna like actually make it through this hour, you are gonna have to get really curious about what is going on with you right now. You're gonna have to get really, really, like just pay careful attention. What is happening in your body? Now, the technique that I had learned, the meditation technique, is called Vipassana. It essentially involved like body scanning. So you would sit quietly and you would just like bring your attention to the top of your head and then down to your eyebrows and to your eyes and your ears and your jaw. And you'd kind of work down your body and just like feel what is there and try not to respond or react to it. Just observe. And then you're like, oh, that's a searing pain in my back. That's fine. I'll just observe. And you have to kind of move your way down your body. And so I just thought, okay, I just need to really pay attention to what's happening in my body right now. I have to get super curious or I'm never going to make it through this thing. What does this resistance that I'm feeling actually feel like? Where am I feeling it? Let me scan through my body and really see what is happening right now. What is happening with me that I am resisting this so much? What does that actually feel like? What are these sensations that I'm experiencing right now in my body in this moment? And the strangest thing happened. So like I said, this is my second retreat. And I would say that like my experience with meditation up to that point was just about like trying, it was hard and painful and uncomfortable. And the whole thing was just like how to have less pain, like how to mediate pain so it's not quite so bad. But I'd never experienced that kind of like bliss that people talk about when they meditate, like that kind of calm, serene, like blissed out feeling. Until I started to get really curious what was going on with me. And I brought my attention in and I paid attention to the really subtle sensations of my body. And then the strangest thing happened. I suddenly felt like my entire body dissolved into a cloud of baby powder. Everything was very soft and airy and light. And I just felt like I could breathe in this way that I'd like never felt before. And then I was like, oh my God, this is amazing. And then like it felt like hitting a brick wall. As soon as I started to grab for it and wanting it, then it just disappeared. And I had to keep working with it. And over the next few days, if I could get really curious and saying, what is happening? I noticed that I could go into that space where something would shift and the suffering would stop. And I didn't feel that kind of anxious resistance anymore. I didn't feel that kind of like, I got to get out of here. I can't do this. And instead it was like, whoa, something shifted and I feel different now. And that attitude of curiosity, I have found, really does shift what you experience. And I think that it's something that we can bring to many of our moments when we feel this kind of resistance. And it's part of why meditator, oh wait, I missed one. There we go. Meditator Pema Chodron, I don't know if you know her, she is amazing. She's written a dozen books and given lots of talks. She follows a Tibetan Buddhist style, and she's wonderful. And she has said that the path of meditation and the path of our lives altogether has to do with curiosity, inquisitiveness. The ground, she says, is ourselves. We're here to study ourselves and to know ourselves now, not later. For her, curiosity is the path. That's how we do it. It's how we wake up to our lives. It's how we become more present. It's how we face a crisis instead of with resistance, with a kind of attention and care, so that we can sift through what's important to us instead of simply resisting what is. Okay, and so for me, that's why curiosity is such an important tool to bring to this practice. Okay, so what is curiosity exactly? Again, I'm a philosopher, I like definitions, so we'll go back. Okay, for me, curiosity means a kind of open awareness and attention to what is. Right? Sorry, I'm admitting people. So it also involves a kind of inquiry. The question is like, what is happening? Or questions, right? It's asking questions of a situation. So what's happening? What is it like, whatever is happening? What is its impact? What is its value, right? It's about asking about our environment, asking about ourselves. That is the primary tool of curiosity. It's the method by which curiosity expresses itself, is through questions. Now, curiosity itself, I think it's important to note that curiosity itself does not involve storytelling, imagination, evaluation, or judgment. The answer to these questions, what is it like? What is the impact of what's happening? What am I feeling? What is the value, right? Is it true? Is it not? Though the answer to those questions may have to involve evaluation, judgment, imagination, right? But the asking of the question itself doesn't involve evaluation. It is just an openness. It is a receptiveness. And so that, I think, is an important attitude to bring, is that open receptiveness. Now, my sense of why this open receptiveness works is because curiosity shifts your orientation from resistant to receptive, and thereby it sort of short circuits the cognitive pathway that leads to suffering. And I'm going to talk more about that in just a minute. But as for example, when I was in my meditation, it was just like, I don't want this, resist, resist, resist. And when I shifted to what is actually happening, what am I feeling, what is going on, the resistance stops, right? It sort of short circuits that pathway of resistance and shifts to something different, to that open receptivity of seeing what is actually happening. So it shifts from it shouldn't be this way to how is it exactly, right? And you can even just feel the difference in those two statements, right? It shouldn't be this way, and how is it exactly? Curiosity, another way of saying it is that curiosity requires what philosophers and meditators alike call a beginner's mind. And a beginner's mind is something that has been very valuable in the history of philosophy since its Western origins. So, for example, Socrates, who is considered the father of Western philosophy, was, according to Greek, mythology, the Oracle of Delphi called him the wisest man in all of Athens. And the reason, he was just like, wow, Why would that be? How could that possibly be? And he said that the reason that he was the wisest man was simply that other people thought they knew things, and he knew that he did not know things. He actually approached the world with a kind of beginner's mind and said, well, I don't know, tell me exactly what that means. What is justice? What is beauty? What is art? What is the right thing to do? And so these really, really basic questions, like, I don't know the most basic things. I'm coming with a kind of open receptiveness to discovering the foundations as if I'm a beginner, right? And so in the Apology, Socrates says, I'm better off than he is, for he knows nothing and thinks that he knows. I neither know nor think that I know. So that makes it, at least I know where I stand. Okay, so the cognitive pathway. I want to say a little bit more about that. So when I said that curiosity short circuits that kind of cognitive pathway that leads to that resistance and leads to that suffering, I'm going to tell you a little bit about what I mean by that. Okay, so I think this is my sense of how it works, right? Just based on my studies. If any of you are more knowledgeable in neurocognition or psychology than I am, I'm happy to hear your thoughts on it. But here's my sense of how it works. There's a stimulus. Let's say you hear a noise, right? And I put stimulus in parentheses here. Sometimes there's not a stimulus. Sometimes there's just a bodily change, right? So let's say the stimulus is you hear a noise and there's a bodily change of like, right? Your heart rate quickens, your pulse tightens, you like kind of, your body reacts. Sometimes there's no stimulus. Sometimes your body just changes. Like you run out of food and then it gets hungry and now you have the new pathway, right? But let's take this example. If you hear a noise, your body changes, right? And I think your body actually reacts first, right? Your body reacts first. And then after your body reacts, there is this little kind of what I'm going to call a precognitive reaction, right? Before any thought actually happens in your mind, you have this kind of reaction. And the Buddhists say that there are really only two kinds of these like precognitive reactions. One is either I like that, I want it, craving, right? Feels, and that we're referring to is the sensation of the body, right? The feeling that you are having. So either I like that, I want more of it, or I don't like that, I don't want that, right? My body feels bad, I don't want to be here, right? And that's before you even have any like cognitive thought. Once you have, so react or stimulus, body changes, precognitive, usually like, don't like this. And then the thoughts kick on. Then there's the story, right? Oh, I don't like this. What's going on? There must be something bad happening out there. Is there a predator? I don't know. What's going on? There's someone, there must be someone outside. It's got to be my neighbor who's been lurking around my yard. I don't know what he's up to, right? And then you're off on a story, right? You tell a story about what's happening, what it means for you and the situation around you, right? Then that can lead to this kind of like, God, I fucking hate that guy is always like lurking around my yard. Why does he, what is he up to? He's a bad dude. I'm angry now and I'm frustrated or I'm afraid or whatever it is. And then maybe I go around the circle again a few more times to, 2, 3, 4, and I tell more of a story and I whip myself up and I've got a really elaborate whole fantasy happening now, right? And then I go to an action, right? And now it's like, I'm going to go out there and give him a piece of my mind, right? Open the door and then look out and it's like the neighbor cat or something, right? So, and this is how it works, right? We go through this stimulus from to the body reaction and then to the thought and the emotion. So now I want to say is that when I was at my meditation retreat, I was able to kind of back my way up. The whole goal here for us is going to be to try and go to earlier in this chain and see what's going on, to get curious about this own chain happening in our minds and in ourselves. Now, when I was at my meditation retreat, I was able actually to spend quite a lot of time kind of going here to number 2 and saying, what is actually happening in my body, and really pay attention to the sensations of my body, and kind of like wedge myself in here between 2 and 3 to try and not do that kind of precognitive, oh, I don't like this, but instead to just observe without resistance, right? And as soon as I felt resistance, there was some, my body let me know. But I think it's kind of hard to do this, to really get to the number 2 here, to your bodily sensations in a really deep way, unless you've had like several days of meditation to kind of make your way there. I think certainly you can do it when you're really activated and kind of say like, what's actually happening with me right now? And doing that is really valuable. And I think that that's a tool that you can use, mindfulness meditation. And, maybe I'll do another class on that someday. But for today, I actually want to spend some time on number 4 here, the thought or story about yourself. And I think that is what I usually spend time with my clients on, this sort of number 4. What is the story that you are telling? What is the story you're telling about yourself in your world? And then how is that impacting the rest of it? Okay. So we're getting close to being done with my talking points here. Okay, so in order to investigate your story, I think that there are 4 questions that you can ask yourself to go to number 4 and to sort of short circuit, as I said, that pathway of suffering. And we're going to get really curious. Now, remember, questions are the vehicle of curiosity, right? They are the way that we use curiosity to wedge our way into that cognitive pathway and sort of see what's going on in there, right? So we're going to ask these 4 questions, and I just want to mention that these are adapted from a woman named Byron Katie. You should read her book called Loving What Is, which I found to be really helpful and useful. Okay, so the first question is this thought true? Which is kind of a big question. And so let's see how it works. So let's say you lost your job in this pandemic. And maybe you have the thought operating somewhere under the surface there that without a job, I'm worthless, right? I don't have a purpose, I don't have meaning, my life is worthless, right? Let's say you have the thought separately, my kids ought to listen to me, and you get really frustrated when they don't. Or let's say you have the thought this country is going to fall into a civil war. All of those things, if they do not map onto reality, can cause a lot of suffering, right? Or even if the last one does map onto reality. But the thing is, when we ask the question, is this thought true? Now, true is a very big, juicy, tricky word for philosophers. But the thing is that value judgments, these are all value judgments. Worthless, should, anything with a should in it is a kind of value judgment. And then the third one is a kind of prediction, right? Something that hasn't happened yet. So any value judgments or predictions are human creations, right? They come from us, and we say this is how it is, but this is how it ought to be, or this is what it means, right? Or this is how it will be. And each of those things are not actually reflective of reality per se. They are judgments about what we see, right? And so if you ask, are they true? Well, it's really kind of hard to know how to answer that question. So how would you know if it was true or not? It's not like you could go, without a job, I'm worthless. Okay, well, let's just see which rock to look under to know whether or not that's true. You can't like find it out there in the world, right? Worthlessness is an evaluation that's a human invention. So it starts to get kind of tricky when you ask, is this thought true? You might feel like it's true, without a job, I'm worth nothing. And then I think the second question to ask yourself is, can you absolutely know that it's true? Then it's like, well, I mean, what would that absolute knowledge look like? And how would you access absolute knowledge about it? And the goal here actually is introduce doubt into your commitment to this thought, right? It's to insert a little bit of doubt into your story, because right now your story is causing you a lot of suffering. And so if we introduce doubt into that story, then things can start to loosen up. And it's like, oh, what is going on inside there? The third question is to ask, what is the impact of this thought? Right? How does this thought make you feel? If the thought is, without a job, I'm worthless, how does that thought make you feel? Probably not so good if you've lost your job, right? You feel worthless, and that feels bad. It feels bad in your body. It feels bad in your relationships, right? What do you do? What does, when you have this thought, what do you do? Well, probably like, binge on Netflix and potato chips and not much else, right? Or maybe you drink more than you ought to, or maybe you are doing other self-destructive kinds of behaviors. How do you show up in the world and with others when you have this thought, right? You may not be super kind to yourself or to other people with it. So the third question is, what is the impact of this thought? So is this thought true? Can I absolutely know that it's true? What is the impact of this thought? And then finally, who would you be if you didn't have this thought? Now, it's very hard to just drop a thought, right? And just say like, oh, I'm just going to give up the thought. And the goal here again is not to drop the thought. It's just to ask the question, right? Thoughts seem to they have like this life of their own where they just sort of arise whether we or not we want them to, right? Right now, it's just to be curious. It's just to ask the question, who would you be without this thought? And again, how might you feel without the thought? If you didn't believe you were worthless without a job, then maybe you would feel a little better, right? Maybe you would act a little differently. Maybe you would show up in the world a little differently. I find often that in just asking the question, that insight and truth and wisdom seem to arise, right? Because saying like, oh, that's a bad thought, you shouldn't think it, is often not very helpful, right? Because like, well, I can't control it, I just do. I just believe it, right? But if you see the impact of the thought and you see how it might be without it, you start to kind of get like, oh, there's some clarity here. And when you ask the question, is this thought true? There is often somewhere inside of you, there is a voice that knows the answer to that question. And maybe you're not used to listening to it, but something will say, it feels true, but is it true? Can I be absolutely sure that it's true? Maybe not. And when you start to loosen your grip on those thoughts and you start to see the impact of them and you get curious, right? Just asking these questions. It's not about resisting or changing or saying that this is bad and that is good. It's just asking the questions. And you start to see the impact of this thinking on your life and on your mind. And then eventually it becomes like, oh, well, you give up that thought because it hurts when you have it, right? It's like putting your hand on a hot stove. It's like you don't do it not because you're a bad person if you do it. You do it, you take your hand off the stove because it hurts. When you think the thought, it hurts. And so then you just start to realize like, maybe I just shouldn't hold on to this story. Maybe I shouldn't hold on to this thought. And then maybe my hand won't hurt so much. Maybe I won't hurt so much. Okay, now, why might we avoid or fail to be curious? If it brings us so much clarity, why would we avoid it? And I think the answer comes here from Brené Brown. She says, choosing to be curious is choosing to be vulnerable because it requires us to surrender to uncertainty. We don't want to ask questions sometimes. We don't want to be curious about the stories we tell ourselves because I missed a slide here. Let's see if I found it. Nope, that's right. We don't we don't ask these questions because they, we don't want to know what the answer is. Maybe we feel really comfortable in our old thoughts that are not serving us. Maybe we don't know what we'll find if we start asking questions. And that's scary. And we don't like, we don't like uncertainty. It requires a lot of vulnerability of us. But I think that doing this, right, saying like, well, I don't, saying like, I don't want to be curious, I don't know what I'll find. Well, the solution to that problem, I think, is more curiosity. You can just apply the same questions to the thoughts that arise about asking questions. So if you have a thought like, if I ask the questions, then maybe I'll learn the ugly truth. And then you can ask the question about that. Well, is that true? Can you absolutely know that that's true? What is the impact of that thought? Who might you be without that thought? And in this way, curiosity becomes this tool that is always self-referential and self-supportive, right? You can always turn it back on itself. And that's wonderful. One of the wonderful things I think about the philosophical inquiry process is you can always turn it back on itself and say, is the way that I'm going about this process bringing me, is that true? Is that giving me what I want, right? My resistance I feel to that process, I can always use the process on itself, right? So it's always sort of strengthening in that way. Okay. And one last thing here to go back to Pema Chodron. Again, curiosity. She says we can learn to meet whatever arises with curiosity and not make such a big deal out of it. Instead of struggling against the force of confusion, we can meet it and relax, right? We can always just ask these questions. And doing that, as I said, that number 4 in that cognitive path there, we start to break apart the story that we tell, which then prevents us from going around that loop a few more times until we just want to like numb out and go drink a 6-pack, right? We stop it in its tracks. We ask a bunch of questions, and then it starts to get some spaciousness and some lightness. And you start to feel a little bit like you're a cloud of baby powder and just rolling with it. So that's the goal here today. And I think that that tool is what I'd like to do with our volunteers. So thank you to Jake and to Allison for volunteering. And so what I'd like to do now, before we begin with you, I want to just pause for a minute and see if anyone has any questions about anything I've said so far. What we'll do is we'll answer any questions, and then we'll work a little bit with Jake and with Allison on basically going through and asking these 4 questions, right? We'll identify a thought that you're having. We'll go through the 4 questions. We'll see what happens, right, in the process and sort of see what it looks like. And then, we can do another Q&A afterwards, and people ask questions and discussion. Yeah, Jake?
So I think I know the answer to this, but I'm curious what you would say. I'm curious about what you might say about the difference between kind of sitting in a mindfulness experience and sitting in a curiosity experience.
Mm-hmm. I think they are one and the same. I think it's just the question is what is the subject or the object of the curiosity, right? So like, what are you curious about? Are you curious about the sensations of your body? Are you curious about the speed and strength and experience of your breath, right? Those are typically the objects of focus for meditation, right? Mindfulness is it's sort of taking meditation off the cushion and out into the world, right? So if you're like cooking dinner, you can be very curious about what is the sensation of cutting a carrot? What's the smell? What's the feeling? What's the What's the sight, right? What are all of the sensory input of that experience, right? And bringing a kind of mindfulness or curiosity to that experience, right? And then, you know, the questions of like, what's the story you're telling and what is its impact? That's bringing curiosity to the kind of cognitive, you know, storytelling that your mind is doing. So I think curiosity is a tool that operates within mindfulness, and it just sort of depends on what your object of focus is. Other questions before we see this in action? Okay. All right, Allison, I think is that you? Are you off mute?
Yes.
Okay, I'm going to mute you real quick because I think we're hearing your computer clacking. And so I'll unmute you once we turn to you, okay? Okay. All right. So Jake, you're going to be our guinea pig for everybody.
Actually, I was thinking, if Allison is okay with it, can you start with Allison? Because
Yeah.
I'm not sure if I have a question at this point.
Okay.
Can I have a question? Not about, I only see your screen still. Is that how you'd like it?
Yeah, thank you for saying so. We'll stop sharing the screen so you can see my face again. Yeah?
Yeah.
Good.
It's so hard. It's so hard.
Yeah. And thank you, Allison, too, for sharing with us this group and for being vulnerable. I know that it's not easy, and you were very brave in doing so.
Thank you.
All right, other thoughts, questions, comments, thoughts about this process, thoughts about curiosity, other things that I didn't cover that you'd like to see? Are you curious about curiosity?
There were a lot of things that popped out for me, but for some reason right now, the one thing I just am thinking about is when you spoke about sifting, and that just felt so new to me, the idea that I can maybe sift out certain things to search for what I may really be feeling and didn't even realize I was feeling.
Mm-hmm.
I like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think, you know, as I said, this process, when you go through it, you start to see, like, obviously, you know, the death of our loved ones is something that we will all have to deal with eventually, right? And just saying like, oh, I should just not think about it and all my problems will be solved is not my intention for the answer here. But I do think that in asking these questions, we can see that hanging on to certain beliefs are having a kind of impact on us, and that maybe those are maybe there are some things that we can sift out, right? Mm-hmm. Maybe like holding on to that story is not serving me in the way that I want to show up in the world in this moment where things are all topsy-turvy. And maybe that's a thought that I can sort of sift out of my story for myself. Yeah.
That was also something I never thought of, the idea of looking at my story, especially during this time. And I realized that I had certain thoughts about going through past crises and thinking, and I think it's true, but I realize now there's more to it that will make me be able to go through this just fine. And part of that feels very true. And I realized when you were talking about your story, that was kind of a story also in my head that I think makes me feel safe. that if I know that I've gone through stuff before, I'm just going to do great during this.
Yeah.
And it really made me want to think about that. I don't want to give up the idea that what I'm thinking is going to be true, but I realized that it was also a story that I'm attaching to this, probably as a way, I truly feel, but also as a way of protecting myself. So I'll probably keep that story, but I really want to look at it more.
Yeah. I think that's a wise way of approaching it, right? Because we all tell stories all the time, right? Our lives do not come in a form. Like there's not a, I mean, I don't think that there is a story given to us when we are born that we are required to fulfill. I think that we are the ones that write the story. Like the data happens, right? Like the world is what it is. You have the experiences you have. They're unpredictable and unwanted sometimes, but we have the power to tell the stories about it. That's what's unique and special about humans. We get to interpret our experience and decide what they mean. And if you're gonna tell a story, which we all do, we all tell stories, it might as well be a story that feels supportive, right?
Yeah.
It might as well be a story that makes you feel capable and makes you feel content and makes you feel powerful, because it's always a story, and you can always pick and choose from your experiences to create whatever story you want, right? Other people might not agree with you about your stories, right? I feel like some of our politicians tell stories that seem to have no basis in reality that we may not agree with, but we get to tell the stories, right? And so I agree, like understanding that stories can serve you, that they're powerful, and that they can be great allies, and yet they are still just stories. And don't get too attached to them, because they're still an invention. You know? Sort of the existentialist approach to life. It's kind of like, I like to compare it to like playing soccer, for example. Like you play sports, and it's just like you can get really into the game, and you can get really like, there are goals and there are things you have to do and rules and do this and don't do this, and like there are all these like expectations about how you should play, but the whole thing is still just a game. And if you forget that fact, right, and become too serious about it, then you seem to have like lost touch with what's true there. And so yeah, play the game, but still know that it's a game.
It's funny, in this time, in this wild time of a pandemic, I keep thinking of my stepfather. Who was a philosophy professor, and he used to say, "Life is what happens when you're busy making plans." You know, and I feel like that just keeps, when I hear people in their experiences, "Oh, I was going to do this and this, and now I can't do it," and you know, and it's so interesting. I mean, of course, you know, all the different psychiatrists and psychologists and people are writing all this stuff, and you know, I just read in the Harvard Business Review, there was an article, I can't remember the guy's name, he was talking about that we're in a global grief process. And he talked about Kubler-Ross's, stages of grief. And apparently he was good friends with Kubler-Ross and had asked the family if he could add on a final stage of meaning, creating meaning. And they allowed that. So that was kind of fascinating. Of course, it makes sense, of course, you have to create meaning out of that process of loss.
Yeah.
But I just feel like, I don't know, I feel like, I mean, I certainly have my own story that I was holding on to with, I don't know, it's just, I'm not sure how to put this together, but it's like I feel like I'm hearing these stories or these few things in the future that people were going to be doing. And it's like everyone is having the loss of an idea.
Yes.
It wasn't real yet.
Yes.
You didn't do it yet.
Right.
Although some things were, I mean, I did plan to move from Portland. I moved from Portland. I went to New York. I was getting set up. I mean, then I made a decision, which felt like I was pressured to make the decision, but I made a decision. It was not safe to stay where I was, and I came back to Portland. But there are these stories, there are these ideas, there are these losses of an idea. It wasn't real.
Yes.
And I kind of have been sitting with that. Like, it's just weird. I mean, I'm in this limbo. I have some clients, so luckily I'm able to work online, and so I have that. I'm actually building that up.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know. And there's this whole, I don't know, I'm just throwing that out, that the loss of this idea of something.
Yes. I mean, I do think we are all as you said, in a grieving process. And some of that is like that our daily lives have changed, right?
Big time, yeah.
And we miss our jobs, or we miss our friends, or we miss our family members. But also, I think the idea that we are losing is not only our plans for the future and what we thought was going to happen, but also our sense of identity that comes with those jobs and those relationships and those connections, right? The sense of who we are and what that means and how we show up. And, those are all ideas, right? And those are the things that are really, really being challenged right now. And our values, like suddenly it's like this thing that I thought I cared about is not important to me anymore, right? Or whatever it might be. And those are all ideas. And so it's straight. I mean, it's weird for me because I kind of feel like right now is sort of a moment for philosophers. So my business has actually seen kind of an uptick. And I think it's because we're having like a global existential crisis right now. I mean, that's really what we're dealing with here. And I think that there are a lot of people who have written lots of really smart things about how to manage an existential crisis. And so my hope is that, we can access some of them together.
And I think the thing that's amazing is, and I certainly go back and forth, but like we can certainly trip out and go in a really negative way. Or not, like there is some choice around kind of where we let ourselves go. Yes.
And I'm sorry, Jake, to go back to the screen in the middle of your comment there, but
no problem.
But yeah, I mean, this is also, it's in a moment of crisis that you start to see what kinds of tools people have or don't have for managing crisis. You start to see resilience, and you also start to see when people lack tools, and where their values and priorities are. And so I think things really shift. And I think that's, what is the saying that like the Chinese word for crisis is the same word as opportunity, right? And here we are. So I just want to say we're about at the end here. And I wanted to let you know that my next month, I'm going to do one of these every month. And next month the class will be called Choosing Hope. And it is a philosophical look at hope. Some things we'll talk about will be like the difference between hope and optimism. And to me, it is a very existentialist approach to hope, how to hope in the face of drowning there. So I hope that you will join me. All of you will be on my mailing list. So in a few weeks, you will get two things. In a couple weeks, I'll be sending a newsletter. It will have a recording of this class, so you can watch it again or send it to people if you want to. And then next month, a couple weeks before the class is open, because you have all registered for this one, you'll get early access to the next class. And this class actually sold out within 4 hours of going out on my newsletter. So if you know, that extra time in advance registration will be valuable. So I hope that you all will consider joining me next month. And I hope that you all are well and stay curious about your current situation and about yourself. And I bid you all good luck and courage in sifting through this crisis right now. And I thank you all so very much for joining me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you.